Algebra 1 students, and welcome to another math lesson. This is on Unit 1, Lesson 4. Unit 1 covers algebraic foundations, so please be thinking of your two essential questions as we move through tonight's lesson. You will need to have these answered at the end of the unit. Lesson 4 is on properties of real numbers. Your essential understanding. Relationships that are always true for real numbers are called properties, which are rules that use to rewrite and compare expressions. Important properties include the commutative property of addition and multiplication, the associative property of addition and multiplication, the identity property, and the zero product property of multiplication, and the multiplication property of -1. So we'll be talking about those in tonight's lesson. Your objective is to identify and use properties of real numbers. So your key concept is equivalent expressions. An equivalent expression means that you have two algebraic expressions and they're equivalent, meaning they're equal or the same value for all the variables. All right, let's discuss our key concepts and vocabulary relating to the properties of math. First, we have the commutative property. We have the commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication. And this is when I think of it like you're commuting to work and you just change the lanes. Kind of the same thing. You're changing the lanes of your add-ins to get your sum. So here I have a plus b, which is the same as b plus a. Hopefully this looks familiar. You can say 2 plus 3 is the same thing as 3 plus 2, which gives you 5. Right? Same thing for the commutative property of multiplication. A times b is equal to b times a. And then we have the associative property. Again, we have the associative property of addition and the associative property of multiplication. Here I think of it like you have parentheses, one goes in, one comes out. So here I have a plus b inside my parentheses with c on the outside. And you can see here that the a came out and the c went in. Same thing with the multiplication. Here I have a went out and c went inside. And then we have the identity property. We have the additive identity, which has to do with addition. And so anything you add to 0 is always going to give its identity. So a plus 0 is equal to 0 plus a, which gives you a. Or I can say 7 plus 0 is 7, 0 plus 7 is 7. And then for multiplication, the multiplicative identity, anything times 1 is always itself. So a times 1 is the same as saying 1 times a, which is a. Or I could say 14 times 1 is 14, and 1 times 14 is 14. Then we have the additive inverse. So the inverse means opposite. So if I take a and I add its inverse, which is negative a, I get 0. So 5 and I add -5, I get 0. Same thing with the multiplicative inverse. Again, it's the opposite, so we're dealing with reciprocals. So if I have a over b, and a and b both cannot be 0 because the opposite would be b over a. So if I multiply, I can say 2 times 3, and if I multiply by its reciprocal, 3 times 2, I get 1. So the multiplicative inverse is the reciprocal, and you get 1 as your answer. And then we have the multiplicative property of 0. Anything times 0 is always 0. So a times 0 is 0, 0 times a is 0. Or 2 times 0 is 0, 0 times 2 is 0. right, which property is illustrated? So example 1, we're going to identify the property that we see. So A, z times 47 is the same thing as saying 47 times z. So I change the lanes, so I'm commuting. So it's the commutative property of multiplication. 9 times 1/9 gives me 1. So I have 9, and I have its reciprocal 1/9. So I'm multiplying, so that's going to be the multiplicative identity. And then next I have f plus 5 plus 13, where f and 5 are inside my parentheses. F comes outside and 13 goes inside, so that's the associative property of addition because I am adding. And then next I have 3xyz plus 0 is equal to 3xyz. So I have its identity, and I'm adding 0, so that is the additive identity property. Alright, example 2, we're going to identify the property again, but here we have a quantity that's unknown, and we need to state what that unknown value is for that quantity. A, n plus 12 equals 0. Well, anything times 0 gives me 0, so that means n has to be 0, so that is the multiplicative property of 0. B, I have 7 plus 3 plus z on the inside, and my 7 goes inside, which means my z went on the outside, so z is 4, and that's the associative property of addition. C, 0 plus n equals 8. Well, anything I add to 0 gives its identity, so that means n is 8, and that is the additive identity property. 6 times h equals 6, so anything times 1 gives its property, so that is the multiplicative property, identity property, and h is 1. Example 3, we're now going to take this equation that has been solved on the right side, and we're going to write the step they use to solve. So step 1, they did inside the parentheses, so 3 plus 0 is 3. So that is the additive identity property. Next, they did 5 times its reciprocal, which gives me 1. So that is the multiplicative inverse. Then, the next step they did, because we're following our order of operations, would be multiplication. So 3 times 1 gives me its identity. Negative 3 times 1 gives me negative 3. So that is the multiplicative identity property. And then our last step, I just added from left to right. But you can say 3 minus 3, which is the additive inverse property, which gives me 1. Example 4, we're going to tell whether the statement is true or false, and then if it's false, we have to give a counterexample. So if I'm looking at all real numbers, and I say a plus b, is that the same as saying a times b? Well, it's not always the case. In some cases it's true, and in some cases it's false. So for an example, if I picked 1 and 3, so if I said a is 1 and b is 3, well, 1 plus 3 gives me 4, but 1 times 3 is 3, so here it is false. And remember, there's no property that says that if you add two things together, they give you the same answer when you multiply them. For all real numbers, a times 1 gives me a. Well, this is always true, and that's because of the multiplicative identity property. Well, we are at the end of another fabulous lesson. I hope you enjoyed learning about properties of real numbers. Please make sure you come to class prepared. That means your notes are complete and you get your quick check problems done. Here I have a little joke for you. The multiplication and addition sign asked the negative and division sign. So, you two work from home, huh? Quiet, says the subtraction sign. We really don't like to commute, says the division sign. Get it? Commutative property, commute. So, try to hold back that laughter. All right, see you in class soon.